This time I'm actually in my office, my car, which is frequently my office. When I'm not officing in our Luke's mother's house, I am officing in my car or in a library or in a co-working space. Like in Kansas City, we have quite a few co-working spaces that, since we're a nonprofit organization, they've allowed us to kind of come for free on certain days. And so that's really convenient. But so here I am. Actually, it's raining today. I was going to do this live from our forest, our four-acre urban forest that we're renovating and restoring. But it's raining and it's like 41 degrees right now. And so, I mean, I have a coat, but I think it would be safer if I just did this from my car. Also, I haven't quite figured out how to do your streaming from your phone yet. That's apparently a solution. I haven't figured it out. So we're doing this from here. I've actually kind of planned what I was going to say, but I'm not quite sure if I'm going to stick to that plan. Who knows? But at least I don't have kids throwing stuff at me today. That's really great. And, you know, I don't have as much of the nerves as I had yesterday. I don't know, I was a little nervous. I'm kind of, yeah, still nervous, but that's okay. Yeah, so anyway, I wanted to tell you guys at the beginning here, like just what I've been up to so far today. We're volunteering at Banneker Elementary School, which is here in East Kansas City, basically on Gregory Boulevard, east of 71 Highway in Kansas City. And it is a school where the students, like 100% of the students qualify for free reduced lunch. And I would say, like looking at publications that have come from the school district, between 90 and 100% of, and it's not 100%, but it's very high percentage of students are African American. So that kind of demonstrates kind of the segregation that still exists in the public school system here in Kansas City, something that I really didn't grow up with. You know, growing up, we had kids of all nationalities, all ethnic backgrounds, all heritages, kind of, I mean, not all, but a mix. So it wasn't kind of as highly concentrated segregation like that is. So I was really surprised that things like that still existed, but there's kind of further evidence of my own little bubble. So that's what we were volunteering in the garden. The kids were taking some sweet potatoes out of the ground this morning, and then they got to wash them off, and they got to take them home. These things were huge. These sweet potatoes were like the size of your head, and they got to take them home to mom and dad. And it's something that, like, if their family doesn't have time to do something with it now, it will store well, so they can keep it around until it's really needed. And just fresh, it's right there and available out of the garden. And so that's a really beautiful thing in our opinion. So the game plan for tonight, after I get done with all of my meetings and I put the kids to bed, I'm going to be writing some grants. That's kind of like an ongoing process, but we weren't actually able to pursue very many grants because a lot of grants require a board passed and approved budget. So like our board hadn't passed a budget yet. And that's just kind of a process that you have to go through. So it was a long process. We finally got it done. And I'm really happy that that is something that's, you know, I'm able to do now, is apply for grants and submit my board approved budget with the grants. So thank you to my board for getting to the point where we are mature enough to pass a budget, which is awesome. That's also a reflection of my own ability to prepare something that's decent enough for them to look at. So that's a nice growing pain for like me as an administrator. This is probably really boring to you guys. So I'm going to get to the really exciting stuff. So the way I'm approaching this blog is kind of, it's a rough draft on what I'm hoping will someday maybe become, I don't know, some sort of book, or like helpful at least to someone who needs to have a perspective from different sides. So I'm assuming like this is going to be a very, very rough draft, and I'm assuming that people who are watching are actually interested in hearing it. So, so here goes with that one. I'm just going to keep on going, and the beauty of this relationship between the viewers and us as we're doing this is that if you're not actually interested in what we're doing, you get to walk away. You get to turn off the broadcast, and I get to keep on going through my thought process and gabbing, and you can come back and see if it's valuable later. So I think that's a good arrangement. Anyway, so here's the start of our story. It really comes down to privilege. I came from a privileged background when I was growing up. We were part of a huge church that was in downtown Dallas. We had our own home when I was born. We had our own garden. I could play in a backyard. We had my dad had a job that made it enough money that my mom could stay home with me. So I had an upbringing where my very studious and attention giving mother was always around, and so that was my early childhood, full of lots of engagement. That is really privileged compared to some other children's opportunities. Even now, children in families with two working parents may not have the same kind of advantage as I think that a parent in the home gives. Sometimes people are fortunate enough to do that without the fear that they won't have a career when they come back. Sometimes people don't want a career, but I think that was for me a privilege in growing up. So thank you to my mom. Thank you if you're watching. So that was part of the privilege, but also, another part was that my father had a job that was good enough that when we moved to a area with higher property taxes and higher home values, and we got to build our own home. So I got to walk through the experience of, walking through the walls when they were framing the house and looking at the plumbing as it was coming out of the ground, and not coming out of the ground, but being put in the ground. And that kind of thought process about where we live is just kind of not something that a lot of children experience. And I think that was another part of the privilege. We did go to a really good school. We went to really good schools. And when we moved to Kentucky, which is close to Appalachia, we didn't really experience what is famed to happen in Appalachia. We were in Lexington, Kentucky, where all the horses are and all the old money is. And so I went to high school. It was a public school, and it was actually kind of a public school with a really decent mix of ethnicities in the school, which had its own kind of conflicts at times. But it was a public school where I went to school with people who were like rich kids and people who were not so rich. But I mean, that's a privilege because, some public schools, they're like 100% of the kids that are in the school do not have opportunity and are not probably going to get opportunity, and sometimes fall through the cracks and don't finish school. And so there was a good mix of all sorts of things. And I feel like that's a privilege. So I'm kind of, painting a picture of this privileged upbringing because I didn't realize how differently, when I was growing up, I didn't realize how differently my experiences were from people who had different upbringings until, they prepared me. Basically what it boils down to is privileged upbringings prepare you for good health, for confidence when you're out in social situations, for opportunities, to even be in the right spot when to catch an opportunity when it comes by and recognize it. That's kind of what not being hungry when you're little, not having violence in the home, kind of stressors like that. That's what a privileged upbringing will prepare you to catch, to be able to take advantage of when it comes your way. So I didn't realize how much of a blessing that was until suddenly my husband and I were living in poverty. We'd moved to the Southern Missouri Ozarks to help a friend with a project, and we were expecting a lot more help than we got in settling in and getting to know the people who were around the area. And it was a shock for us to be hungry, to choose not to eat so that our daughter could eat. It was a real shock having to, really piece out where our savings was going to go, trying to figure out which portions would pay for clothing and how much clothing we could afford to replace and where we could go get it, because there was no way we were walking into the usual places where we'd go and get clothing. So the solutions, trying to figure out the solutions of where we're going to do life now that we don't have a lot of money coming in the door, and there wasn't a lot of access to anything out in the middle of nowhere anyway. So that was a real interesting experience, and it kind of scared our friends and family a lot along the ways, but I think it brought us perspective. So, and I say we were suddenly living in poverty, but really, I mean, when we started applying for social services and we started looking at the numbers of like what the lowest threshold of earnings was, Luke and I kind of looked at each other and we realized we have been so proud up to now. Like there had been times where we probably needed help, and we just didn't think we needed it that much, and we didn't want to ask for help. And so, I mean, there had been times on and off that we had been living in poverty from the time when we got married, up until when we had a child. But we just kind of made it work. We weren't so hard off, in our own opinion, that, and it was probably right, we weren't so hard off that we needed government assistance, because that was not who we were. That was our identity, was not to need government assistance. And I think that partly was why we fit in so well in the Ozarks, because that's not a thing that you really want to need to get in the Ozarks. It's kind of, people use what they have and they use their survival skills and they make it work without having to bum off the government dollar. So I hadn't realized that we'd grown up with that kind of ideal, but we had. So it was an interesting identity crisis applying for food stamps. And then we looked at the earnings limits, and we thought, oh my gosh, we could have gotten food stamps probably 5 different times in our lives before we actually went ahead and filled the paperwork out, because we truly, truly were in dire straits. So here's what we experienced. Churches are amazing. Whenever you need something and you're not quite sure what you're going to do about it, hopefully you have a relationship with a house of worship or house of religion, and can go and say, hey, this is going on in my life. What do I do? And they're amazing. That's kind of, if you don't have family around that you can go to, that's like a good second option. So we didn't have family, went to the churches, and it was really where we met the most amazing people, the most giving, and not really giving in a monetary sense, but like they would give their connections. They would give us resources as far as knowledge, what to do, where to go. And that was just amazing. I mean, there was, I think, one time that we connected with a church that, and it wasn't even our own church. It was like through a network of ministers that our church knew we had a need, a pretty dire need, in the middle of winter when we didn't have the ability to heat our home. And so they reached out and found another church that had the resources to give kind of energy emergency funds. And then we pieced the rest of that together. We found about that once you realize you have a problem that you need emergency assistance for. Emergency assistance is such a wonderful thing. Okay, so this is wonderful for when we'd never experienced much of a struggle before, and all of a sudden we were just in a total pickle and couldn't get out of it too easily. So, emergency assistance is great. When it's not great is when you've had to claim you're in an emergency over and over and over again. That's when it's not too great. We've not really experienced that, but we've seen that happen. And once, it's only accessible once. So it was awesome when we needed it. It's not something that you can go to again and again and again. The other thing we experienced was that the paperwork to get constant assistance. So say you really don't know quite when you're going to get a job and unemployment's not available to you. Well, to go and fill out the paperwork and state this, to the state, it takes an enormous form. This form is like 6 pages long and has a lot of technical questions that if you aren't quite sure what the answer is and you guess at the wrong answer, then, and this isn't about like, do you have a convicted felony or have you ever taken drugs? No, this isn't about that. It's about how many people are in your household. Well, so that's one we've run up against. We are living with my mother-in-law, but we don't eat her food. We don't really pay her utilities. We try to help her. We aren't, really in the same, we're not sharing our belongings as other than like the furniture that we sit on and like the stove, so we're really technically in a separate household as her. And it's really good that we kind of drew that line and we're keeping that kind of separate as much as possible, because if we didn't, then we'd have to count her Social Security and earnings as our earnings in our household, which is totally unfair to her. Us just kind of, by all intents and purposes, we're kind of crashing in her guest bedroom. So, and we have been for a couple of years, but keeping it straight was one of those things that we could honestly answer yes on that question, that there were only 4 in our household after we had our son. So my 2 children and my husband and me, that's 4. But if we had answered differently, then we wouldn't have qualified for assistance. So an assistance can come in very many different forms. You can get health insurance through Medicaid if that's available in your state. You can get food stamps are now SNAP, and you can get these food stamps that are based on like your earnings. But that's the other thing. If you're self-employed in any way and you've reported that on your taxes, then sometimes you trying to qualify for a mortgage down the road, trying to say that you earned enough and you didn't take out of your deductions as maybe you didn't keep track of them or something, you can end up looking like you have earned a lot more money than you actually did. And that'll lower the amount of benefits they're entitled to as a recipient. And benefits are meant to be temporary. So it's not like anyone's entitled to benefits for the rest of their life. Only people who are experiencing like true medical disabilities are, and that's arguable too. But anyway, are entitled. That's a really horrible, ugly word. Entitled apparently has become, it's a really bad word to say. But then there's also the other benefits you can receive are there's basically the cash benefits, which are TANF, T-A-N-F. That is what welfare used to be, and it now has become. It's federally funded, so it's federal funds being kind of filtered through the state, and the states do have kind of their own pots of money that fill into that too. All of this is so like loose. I'm not an expert on this stuff, honestly. And so if anybody has a better description of where the money comes from and why that's important, by all means, comment. But yeah, all of this stuff is really, it's hard to fill out all the paperwork because every single type of benefit requires a separate form, and it's all very complex, very long form. And that was kind of an experience for us. And I have a master's degree in bureaucracy. So when we're going through this, we're thinking, what is this like for someone who has difficulty reading? What is this like for someone who never had learning needs addressed when they were growing up, and maybe they passed their classes and graduated and have a job and they are a contributing member of society, but they are not the type of person who can really tolerate a whole bunch of numbers or a whole bunch of answers. The time that it takes to fill this thing out was kind of a long time. So, what if someone just doesn't have the time to do it because they have children and they're trying to work a job? It just doesn't make much more than minimum wage, and so it's not making ends meet. Really, what kinds of, what experience would that be for those kinds of people that are working hard and just need a little bit extra? It doesn't seem like it's a really accessible method of help. So anyway, that's just kind of an interesting insights that we got into the whole experience of having public benefits and applying for that for the first time. So, yeah, and I'm not saying that like what we went through in any way is the worst. It's like a horrible situation, because honestly, listen, it's not. What we went through, we managed it. We figured out how to do it, and we're trying to figure out how to get back out of the situation where we have to depend on the public dollar to live. So, we've got this. I think we're pretty good. We're on this path toward having a nonprofit organization. It's like a mom and pop nonprofit. It has an earnings venture, and we're going to be funded, and I'm writing grants. And so all of it put together, I think we're pretty good on that, because, what we went through is not as bad as the poverty that's experienced by the kids in the case files that I read when I was eventually got a job as an executive director of the Judicial Circuit's CASA program down in Southern Missouri. The case files that I had to read through to be intimately familiar with what these kids were experiencing and needed as a court advocate for them. I mean, I probably did a really horrible job because they didn't all have their own volunteer advocate yet, and I was trying to do my best for all of them that I could, and get them CASAs, get them court advocates that would speak for them. But it was what it was. But the reality of those children that were living down there, the poverty that is being experienced in the Ozarks, that was evidenced by those files. I heard one story. The juvenile officers would tell us stories, and clinical social workers would, licensed the LCSWs would tell us kind of stories about kids to help us understand the need. And children were collecting their drinking water from rain barrels and filtering the Kathy, if you're watching, you'll recognize this story. They were filtering then thank you, by the way. They were filtering the mosquito larvae out of the water through their teeth when they were drinking the water, because that was just kind of what they did. And they'd wipe the mosquito larvae off their teeth after they kind of strained the water through their teeth so they could drink it. There were children who were involved in the drug trade for some reason. They had some role that whoever was manufacturing had a connection to the family, knew that they wouldn't be a suspect to the police, and so they involved the children in the drug trade, like in some role. And the children didn't want really to do that, and some of them kind of got out because they came to the authorities, and that took enormous bravery, especially when everybody knows everybody, and you never know who's going to bring some consequences to the snitcher. Where there was a little boy who he had to take care of himself for months in the summer after his grandmother, who he was living with, she passed away, and they were out in the middle of nowhere, and so he had to bury her, and basically fended for himself for 3 months because school wasn't in. And so when he didn't come back to school, the juvenile officers went over to his house to kind of investigate what's happening with this child, and they found him just kind of living on his own and out in the forest, and manning the house, taking care of the house. And he had buried her, and they had to take him and put him into a foster home. because of that. And it's just amazing the lack of connection to resources that would happen. People were happy living in a trailer with a pickup truck if that was kind of what they could do, and they had their food, they foraged in the forest, or they'd kill a deer and they had a deep freeze outside the trailer, and they would eat off that deer, and they'd trap enough squirrels or raccoons or whatever they could trap. That was fair game for them to eat. It wasn't long ago that everybody lived like that. Everybody, that was kind of the way things were in the Ozarks, and siblings would die if not enough food was trapped and smoked to overwinter. So, that a long time ago was, that's kind of a lifestyle that we don't think of happening really close to the present day, but a long time ago was just 2 generations. So we had an interesting experience with getting to know poverty ourselves in the Ozarks, but we know it was a lot worse for a lot of other people. And so it's hard to say, oh, we had a hard time. You just can't. We just have to keep on going. And we were living in, honestly, we were living in a very nice government housing. It was really nice compared to the first living arrangement that we moved into that had a lot of square footage, but had some infestation problems with like brown recluse spiders and rats and mice and things. And they were dying, and it just wasn't sanitary at all. And there was a lot of like old construction materials in the house that hadn't been properly maintained, and were really a health hazard. And so like the government housing we got into was superior, far superior, and really decent housing, so that was amazing. And I would have never imagined that at any point in my life I would be praising my own experience living in government housing. It was just like out of this world. This whole experience is just like amazing to us. So, our experience, we were earning below federal poverty level because my CASA board of directors couldn't afford much more than that at the level that they were fundraising. And, that was its own kind of difficult puzzle for me to try and fix in the short, 16 months that I was with them. But they could pay me. I had a job. Like that was something we hadn't had for over a year in the Ozarks, trying to figure that out. Doing consulting and scraping together odd jobs to try and make ends meet was a real hard experience. So once I did get a job, once we did kind of have earnings, we were so grateful for it. We were so grateful just to have a job, even though it was not really very much compared to other parts of the country, other people working similar jobs as I was in other parts of the country. I can't even say that it was like a bad salary because it was a job, and I was going to do my best because it was really for a great cause. And I don't know. I feel like I've gotten in a rut there, so I'm going to move on. We noticed how that one of the things that we noticed that we couldn't be grateful for was how different the professionals that provided us with survival services. So things like grocery store clerks, which is, they're still professionals, or pharmacists, not as much pharmacists, but especially physicians, treated us differently when we had Medicare that we were paying for our visit. We just had never realized that would be something that someone experiences. We thought that people mostly are polite, and if they're not polite, it's because they're having a bad day, not because you have a certain type of payment method. And so kind of the looks that we would receive, or the comments that we would receive when I was sitting there sorting through all of the WIC paperwork that you have to bring with you to every grocery store visit if you're on WIC. That's for women, infants, and children. It's basically food stamps for people with very small children. And it was such a convoluted, system because they only would allow you to buy certain things. So WIC was weird, and they would only allow certain brands of beans because of the deal that the government had made with that food manufacturer. Whatever it was, it just took so long to actually complete the transaction at the checkout line that both the people who were behind you in line would be annoyed, or the person who was checking you out at the counter, like with the cash register, would be annoyed that you were actually there getting food. And we didn't receive as much of a hard time about using food stamps. And I think because it was a quicker process, but still it was a little bit of a stigma. We had to kind of keep quiet with the whole we're on food stamps thing when we were down in the Ozarks, because comments would come about how people who are on public assistance are basically just that they're making a career out of being on public assistance, and it's just not right. And people are lazy, and people are, trying to take advantage of people who actually work hard for their money. Wow, we heard so many stories like that. We had so many, because these were like donors that I would be talking to try and elicit support for CASA. And I had to just shut up that I was on public assistance while I'm talking to them, asking them for a couple $1,000s, which was huge for a donation down in the Ozarks, from a civic organization. The people in the civic organization sometimes would be talking about these concepts that like totally judge people who are experiencing hardships. And so I just had to shut my mouth and take the money. It was really awful. But it is what it is. It's kind of like we came to the realization that sometimes people who complain the most about other people taking advantage of what they have are the ones who have grown up with hardship and who have climbed out of it themselves and have so huge of a chip on their shoulder that it just looks like their shoulder. So we have to just kind of take it with a grain of salt and move on and help the people who need help in our reality. So we noticed how the doctors also kind of treated people like they didn't have rights. If they were on assistance, then I don't know if the assumption was that they were uneducated or what, but suddenly if you asked questions about anything in the exam room, the question was passed aside or was taken to the nurse, or you were chided for even like questioning it. The assumption would be made that you were against the method that had been suggested, and that why would you ask that question? So it was odd. One time I needed a tetanus shot, I think. So it was a vaccine against tetanus, and I said, okay, what am I going to actually experience as far as side effects here? Because I was pregnant and I'd stabbed myself in the leg with a crochet hook, and that sounds awful, but it was stupid. It was hanging out of my purse after I'd put it into a pocket. Like the hook end was actually sticking out of my purse, and my purse fell off my shoulder and swung against my leg, and the darn crochet hook just lodged itself right in my upper thigh. And so it was super painful and just awful. It was so hard to get it out because this hook was in there, like pulling the flesh back outside of me. Oh, it was awful. I'm so sorry if anybody like gets queasy about things like that. Oh, so I went to the doctor and needed this tetanus shot. And of course I was pregnant. I didn't want to go through another like head cold situation or like body ache situation, because when you're pregnant, you're miserable enough and you don't want to have a cold. So I was like, all right, what do I have to look forward to here? The guy assumed that I was like a non-vaxxer or like anti-vaxxer, and that I didn't want to have the vaccine because I like assumed that there was mercury in it. And he gave me this big lecture about mercury. And I'm like, no, actually, I don't want to explain why I asked, because that's just, I don't have time for that either, buddy. So it was really awful. Anyway, the second time where I was like, wait, I have a patient rights and I should know what's going to be happening to my body before you do it. was when basically something had happened. You have to be really careful about all the flora and fauna that happen in the baby making zone when you're pregnant. You have this baby growing, and so somehow I had developed some sort of like staph infection, and that was embarrassing enough because that staph comes from the poo area. I was like, oh my gosh, what did I do? I didn't wipe carefully enough or something. I'm so sorry. This is gross, but what happened was they called the prescription in and didn't even tell me that they had called, that I had a problem, that I had an infection at all. They had taken a pee sample, of course, like they do at every doctor's visit when you're pregnant. And they had noticed this kind of presence of staph bacteria in the pee sample. And so they called the pharmacy that was closest to me, which we lived in a small town. It was one pharmacy, so they couldn't go wrong there. Called in some antibiotics for me and didn't tell me that they were doing it. And so I got a call from the pharmacy out of the blue. They say, okay, your prescription's ready. And I said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't have a prescription ordered from me. You must have the wrong patient. They said, oh no, we do. We have the right patient. They confirmed all my information again. And I said, what are you talking about? Why do I need a prescription? And they said, I don't know. You need to take this up with your doctor. Okay. So I called the doctor's office and they said, oh yeah, we had a culture come back positive for staph, and we wanted to make sure that you could take care of that as soon as possible. And so, okay, here's your order for your prescription. Now you know about it. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe next time call me before the pharmacy randomly calls. And, they hadn't even briefed me on what exactly was wrong with my body to need the infection, like the antibiotics to get rid of an infection. Like, we're talking like basic care principles here. And that was like, really? Because I'd never had that happen before, ever, So then the third thing that happened with doctors is actually a longer story than I probably have time for on this cast. So that's going to have to be another time. Oh my goodness. It was crazy. And that also had to do with pregnancy. So women who are watching, you're going to be completely okay with it. But men who are watching, I'm so sorry, you're going to be grossed out. I apologize. And we'll just hold that off till another cast. And I'll try to like warn everybody beforehand, like on the outside, the description of the podcast, so that you can bypass that if you really don't want to hear about it. That's good. Yeah. Power of information. It's everywhere, right? So anyway, it was just kind of a big eye opener that I think started us along this path of like really caring about people who have had to live in poverty and have had to try and make it with assistance or without. So, because the reality is being raised with low income around you, a low income situation, it basically predisposes you for a low income future. Basically does. In a majority of the cases, a vast majority of the cases of people who have grown up in a low income situation, they're going to continue in a low income situation unless they really want to stress themselves out and take on this high risk prospect of climbing the ladder, which basically means that they're going to be leaving their family or leaving their hometown. And so if that's something they really want to put themselves through, they can do that. But they're really, in doing so, separating themselves from the social safety nets that are always available to us and don't cost any taxpayer money. And that is family and friends. That kind of social safety net, if it's present, does a lot of good. And we really found that out, especially when we didn't have family and very few friends living around us in the Ozarks. So God bless the people who reached out and trusted these weird city folk that came down to live in the Ozarks and helped us out. Because that's the way people can make it. And so that got us onto this kick of making a nonprofit organization that really emphasizes the strengths of people's communities that surround them and the ways that people can build equity in their communities so that they can start adding opportunity and adding enrichment to the experiences that children have when they're growing up, to the experiences that people have in life, the quality of life for people who have lived in a neighborhood all their lives and want to continue living in that neighborhood. That's one of the experiences that got us to care so much. So I wanted to share that, and I hope this is a lot better podcast than yesterday. I'm sorry if it's like takes forever for me to get anywhere on a concept, but I'm hoping you enjoyed my little stories, and there are lots more there where that came from, so it'll keep on happening. And maybe someday it won't be, ooh, it's stopped raining. So no, but I've done enough of like the whole walkthroughs of my forest. I think I'm going to go ahead and just end the podcast because I think it feels right. So I think everyone who follows up, if you're not here live, if you're watching after the fact, thank you so much for taking an interest in what we're doing. And I will see you the next time, which hopefully will be tomorrow. We'll see. Thank you. Now I got to figure out how to stop this thing. Bye.